It's really great to have all of you here tonight, a good crowd, and such an important topic as we continue our series on challenging dialogues around contemporary issues. This is our second challenging dialogue event of the academic year and our fourth overall. In October, we welcomed alumnus Kyle Bowser, and maybe some of you had the opportunity to participate in his very engaging activity talking about immigration and deportation and some of the challenging dialogue around that issue. So if this is your first time attending one of these lectures, you should know that this series does not seek to solve a specific issue or persuade someone to a particular conclusion. Instead, it's designed to help us all realize the importance of keeping lines of open communication, which is really so important, and we don't see too much of that in our society today. Too often, people want to argue a point, rather they don't want to just argue a point, they have a conversation and they should consider all sides of an issue in a conversation. And so it's really incredibly important to keep these communication lines open and to engage in open discussions. And that's how we learn, and of course there's no better place to do that than at Ohio University. This lecture series is one of there's not too many of these like this across the United States, and I'm really proud that we have it here, particularly during this unique time in our country's history where there's so much divisiveness. And so I'm very proud that all of you are taking part in tonight's program, and I hope others will follow Ohio University's lead with this type of lecture series. So it's my pleasure tonight to introduce New York Times reporter Lisa Friedman, who's here with us this evening to lead us in her presentation covering climate change in the age of Trump. She's an award-winning journalist, and Lisa's work focuses on climate and environmental policy, and she's covered 8 different international climate symposia talks. In her work, she's chased climate-related stories from the bottom of a Chinese coal mine to the top of snow-capped Himalayan mountains. Before joining the New York Times, Lisa covered Washington, D.C. for publications such as the Oakland Tribune, the Los Angeles Daily News, Climate Wire as well, where she led a team of 12 reporters. She attended Columbia University for her undergrad, and then her master's degree in journalism was from the University of Maryland. Outside of the newsroom, she and her husband actually own a pizzeria and a bakery in Washington, D.C. So quite diverse there, and we appreciate that as well. So I'm thankful Lisa's here tonight with us, and I'm looking forward to her presentation. So let's welcome to Ohio University, Lisa Friedman.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is on. I always feel the need to say that my husband does all the work. I bring home the health insurance in the family. The pizzeria is all his. President Ellis, thank you so much, and thank you for having me here today. This is really such an honor. I'm going to talk about covering climate change in the age of Trump, but I thought I'd start on a positive note. And that is the state of climate journalism today. When I first started covering climate change, I fell into climate change coverage. Like a lot of reporters, our beats choose us sometimes and not the other way around. I was a political reporter for many years, climbing the rung of newspapers, and the ladder started to fall out in 2008 with the economic decline, and I came to climate reporting completely by accident and discovered it was the best beat I'd ever had. And it's a beat about absolutely everything. And yet when I started on that beat 10 years ago, it was a really, really difficult time for environmental reporters. It still is in many ways, but what we're seeing not just at the Times, but at a lot of papers, is a real resurgence in environmental reporting and also in climate reporting specifically. The New York Times, I came to the Times in 2017. We had about a year previously established a climate desk. And I thought that it would be helpful to tell you a little bit about how we work, because I think it is pretty unique. And it really speaks to the commitment that the paper is making to climate coverage. The New York Times, so we have a 15-person climate team at the New York Times, between reporters and editors and multimedia experts. We have a mini publication into ourselves covering climate change, and it's truly amazing. But what's interesting about how we work isn't just the size of it, but also how we are embedded structurally in the newspaper. The New York Times works with desks, right? We have the national desk, the metro desk, the foreign desk, the Washington desk. Climate is the Times' first subject area desk. And what that means is that as a reporter, I'm not sort of wrestling for the attention of the national editor, who is also looking at education policy stories that day or healthcare stories that day. My editor on the climate team is sitting with the rest of the desk editors, pitching climate stories every day, pitching climate stories for the front page every day. And climate stories are getting on the front page at least once a week at the Times, sometimes twice a day. A lot of times people say to us, I wish you had a specific climate page. And we do. We have a place where our coverage kind of lives, but we don't have a climate section of the Times. And this is something that we talk about a lot. I think one of the things that we find really important to do at the Times is weave our coverage into all parts of the publication. So, again, with our editor being, at the table every day at the budget meetings with all of the other editors, we have a chance in the moment when fires break out in Australia to say, okay, how about in this first day story, we need a few smart graphs from one of your climate science reporters about how climate change affects wildfires. Maybe day 2, we need a separate story on the science of wildfires. So we're able to weave our coverage into everyday coverage. If a business reporter is getting a pitch from a company that is bragging about going carbon neutral, they have a desk they can come to and say, how big a deal is this? Should we, is this newsworthy? What should we truth squad here? So this, just gives you a little bit of a glancing look at our coverage. Just in the past, these are some of the climate stories we've had just in the past 2 days. But I think one of the things that really makes us unique and what we're trying to do in this visual age is find new ways to tell stories. Our climate editor is Hannah Fairfield, is a former graphics editor, which is an unusual route to take to be the editor of a major section at the Times. And what she really pushes us to do all the time is think of ways to tell climate change stories, to bring home to readers why this matters to you, how this affects your lives. So I want to highlight some of the really unique things we've done. Some of them I wish were my stories. They're my colleagues' stories. This is one of my favorites. This is how much hotter is it in your hometown than when you were born. Extremely hot days, more than 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Let's take Athens, Ohio. If you were born in Athens, Ohio, not Athens, Georgia, okay, in 1985, you experienced about 14 days a year where temperatures reached at least 90 degrees. Whoops, whoa, I didn't mean to do that. Okay. Today, Athens, Ohio sees about 20 days at or above 90 degrees on average. And by the time this person who was born in 1985 is 80, models show there could be 44 days above 90 degrees in Athens, Ohio. This is a really fun one to play with. You can always come to me afterwards for the URLs here, but this took my colleague Nadia months and months of data work to put together. This was a way to help people see things other than a narrative story. This is a piece best seen on your phone. However, you can see how your city compares with some of the world's most polluted cities. Those little particles are PM 2.5. And let's see, I haven't tried this. No, it's not going to do Columbus. There we go. Let's do Columbus. We are now seeing pollution in Columbus on the worst air quality day this year. Moderate, not terrible. But compare that to air in California, which reaches very unhealthy levels. If you do this on your phone, you can see the air quality in your room or your city when you're walking around outside. We also think about how to tackle subjects that are close to our everyday lives, like how we eat. Some of the most common questions we get on the climate team is, should I stop eating meat? Why don't you write more about how important it is to stop eating meat? This isn't an interactive story, but we're able to kind of lay out for people the average greenhouse gas impacts in about 50 grams of protein from various foods. And we put together a package on looking at everything from how animals are raised to the benefits of the Impossible Burger and fake meat. This is one I did with a colleague. We wanted to look at, there has been a tremendous amount of turnover in the Trump administration. I'm kind of thankful that the days of covering Scott Pruitt are over so that I could be here talking with you about policy and not trying to buy a Chick-fil-A franchise for his wife. But because there's been so much turnover, we went back and took a look at all of the people who run agencies at, now directly overseeing air, land, and water, and helped lay out for people the history. I mean, what we found was 15 of the 20 key people in government have lobbyist backgrounds, including the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, Andrew Wheeler, the Secretary of the Interior, David Bernhardt, and many of the key people below them. I want to point out one last story that is not mine, but one that I love from the LA Times, and I think it's really indicative of the ways that the reporters all over are trying to find really smart ways to tell really difficult stories. LA Times reporters wanted to try to help people understand the choices that coastal communities have to make when they are trying to protect their areas from sea level rise. And there's very few choices. There's about 3 choices, and they're all bad. Your choices are build a seawall, which is expensive and can makes people angry because you're blocking access to the water also could be a waste of money, and get damaged. Choice B could be moving the pardon me, I'm blanking on the word. Moving relocating communities, right? And that creates a whole other set of tremendous problems for politicians. And so what they did was they created a game that you can play. The oceans are rising. You want to save your community. New flood maps show the sea could rise 3 feet in the next 30 years. Homeowners are begging you to build a rock wall to block the ocean, but environmentalists worry the man-made barrier would ruin the beach. President Nellis, what would you do? Would you build a rock wall? Would you add sand to widen the beach? Or would you hire a consultant for more information? Okay, let's try adding sand. Okay, that was expensive, but the beach was in great shape all summer. People love you. Oh, but then it washed away. Let's see what happens. Oh, you get 8 turns to win the game. Okay, your town is thriving, the economy's good, but people around town are fretting about the rising ocean. Jeff DeBalco, what do you do next? Do you think it's time to build that rock wall? Do you want to try to add more sand? Or should you hire a consultant again?
Let's see what the wall does.
Okay, let's try the wall. You're killing the budget, putting a strain on the city budget, but homeowners are relieved. The neighborhood council awards you mayor of the year. Yes, indeed, exactly. Your rock wall has kept homeowners safe, but everyone else is pretty upset because the beach is getting smaller, the beach is getting more crowded. You've got 2 choices left. Anyone over here want to choose? You want to add more sand to the beach, or do you want to propose a plan to buy out and move homes away from the coast? Shout it out. Buy out? Oh, everyone hates you now. In order to move the seaside homes, all 4 homeowners need some incentive. How much are you willing to pay them? Right? These are the and it goes on. You have a lot of tough choices. It's just not easy. And I love this so much. I go back to this story all the time. I wish I had written it myself. I think it's so smart and such an inventive way to show people, that there's very few choices and none of them are good. They all come with unintended consequences. Let's say we're gonna spend a lot of money. Oh, we busted the city's budget, did we? Oh, I can't. No. All right, let's move on. So this brings me to my beat. I cover federal energy and climate policy. I'm based in Washington. Like President Ellis said, I spent 10 years covering international issues for a publication called Climate Wire before I came to the Times. I went to Bangladesh, I went to Haiti, I spent time in Nepal. I wrote about communities on the front lines of climate change and what some of the poorest communities in some of the world's poorest countries are facing when it comes to sea level rise, particularly, but also rising temperatures and the threat multiplier. I'm trying not to use all the jargon that Jeff DeBalco taught me when I was in in Washington, but it is, but all the ways that climate change acts as a threat multiplier to communities who are already living on the edges of society. Now I'm covering federal energy policy in Washington. I joke sometimes that I write obituaries for climate regulations. Is most of what I do. Just to take you back, in 2009, Congress tried and failed to pass cap and trade legislation that would have addressed climate change. With that failure, the Obama administration then decided that it was going to act via regulation. And it enacted a suite of regulations aimed at reducing emissions from power plants, from reducing oil and gas leasing on federal lands, reducing methane on federal lands, imposing new ways that the government needs to think about climate change when it builds. And at this point, almost all of them have been rolled back. I'm just going to highlight a few of them here for you that are some of the significant ones. The Clean Power Plan would have reduced emissions from coal-fired power plants. The administration has rolled that back and replaced it with a weaker version. The administration has rolled back regulations curbing methane, mercury, which is not a climate issue, but was part of the Obama administration's efforts to really rein in coal plants. In the coming weeks, we're going to see a final rule revoking both California's ability to set stricter auto emission regulations than the federal government, and also to roll back Obama-era emissions cuts on vehicle tailpipe emissions. The administration has rolled back energy efficiency for light bulbs. It has taken a law called the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the bedrock environmental law that sort of informs how we go about building infrastructure projects in the United States, and stripped the responsibility to consider how climate change will play a role when we build not just pipelines, but also roads and bridges. Then there's things that have little to do with climate change, but are just a whole other suite of rollbacks. And I'm doing this because I just want to give you the breadth. I mean, you could take a look at something that we have here, which are showing the 95 rollbacks ongoing in the administration, and we roll this with every story that we do. But I think it's really something else to see, how frequent and how fast the rollbacks are happening. We've rolled back protections on endangered species. We've also, I'm going to come back to that. I'll come back to the transparency. And we've also, of course, told the United Nations that the United States is going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And yet, on the other hand, you have states that are doing a tremendous amount on climate change. You have cities that are doing a tremendous amount on climate change. It's not enough to overtake what is not being done by the federal government, but it's also been a pretty significant effort. You have universities that have declared they are still in the Paris Agreement, and so much is going to hinge. This next election is going to really determine how much all of these regulatory rollbacks that I showed you matter. I mean, we've just started now to try to capture what the impact of all of these rollbacks are. And sometimes it's hard to tell, because sometimes these regulations don't actually start for a few years, so you can't really measure the impact of having rolled it back. So this is one area where we have been able to quantify. Early on in the Trump administration, the administration offered a Solicitor General's opinion, which said, incidental takes of migratory birds. If you kill a bird in the course of doing business, you should not be held criminally liable. In the past, for several decades, if you were if you had a construction crew, you had to take measures to protect migratory birds. If you killed birds by accident, you could be held liable by fines or prosecution, or more importantly, if there was a massive oil spill, like the BP spill, the oil companies would be held liable for the deaths of those birds. That's no longer the case. And what the administration has said that unless one can prove that the intention of killing birds, that the intention was to kill birds, that you were committing a hate crime against birds or going out and shooting birds, if a bird is killed and it wasn't the intention of the business activity to kill birds, there should be no enforcement. And what we have found through emails that we were able to obtain through public records laws was that by being let off the hook, companies and industries were stopping even very modest actions that they had taken to protect birds, like counting when they were killed or telling the government. With the cop off the beat, there's the wildlife cops are off the beat, and in dozens of examples across the country, we found that birds were being killed, and the federal government was saying, it's okay. If you want to act voluntarily to save these birds, that's fine, but you're no longer obligated. And in the most striking example that we found, in Virginia, there was a bridge and tunnel project that was being planned, and the state had been working proactively with a university to find a way to save and to find an alternate nesting area for about 25,000 seabirds that made their home in this area where the construction was going to be. The regulation changed. The Trump administration wrote to the state in an exchange and said, just to be clear, this is now voluntary. You are not obligated to do anything. And a plan that the state had almost finalized to develop an artificial island for these birds was shelved. And now about 25,000 birds, which have migrated south for the summer, are going to come back to find that their nesting ground has been paved over. I said I was going to be positive, and here I am. But I think one of the things that is, and here's where I'm going to turn to, President Nellis was talking about how this is such a challenging issue, and this is something that has been really difficult for Democrats and Republicans to talk about together and to find some common ground on. And so I want to sort of close out by telling you what's happening in Congress, because I do think that we're in a really interesting moment. Folks here have heard of the Green New Deal. So, between things like, the Green New Deal getting a lot of attention, Democrats winning the House and making climate change a major issue in the House, there has been a really interesting, maybe it's too strong to say sea change, but there's been a really interesting shift among Republicans in Congress. I mention this in context of the Green New Deal because there's a lot of concern among conservatives about the Green New Deal. But as they've been criticizing that policy idea, reporters like me who cover climate change have kept coming back to them and saying, okay, well, what's your plan then? If you don't like that, what do you want to do? And so, there's a real sense that they have to come to terms with the fact that this is a policy that needs to be embraced. I want to skip this for a minute and go to this polling. They're also seeing polling. Young people care about climate change. Young Republicans care about climate change. Not to the same extent as Democrats, but across the spectrum, young people of both parties recognize that climate change is real, is largely caused by human activity, and believe that the government should do something about it. Again, very different philosophies. There are, Republicans by and large don't want to see regulation. They want to see conservative approaches to addressing climate change. And I think what's fascinating is that that is starting to happen. Tomorrow in the House, Republican Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and a number of other Republicans are unveiling the beginning of what they say will be a three-pronged package to address climate change. It's going to involve things that not everybody likes. It's going to involve funding for carbon capture and storage. There'll probably be a nuclear component at some point. It's going to involve a tree planting idea that President Trump floated as well when he was in Davos and mentioned in the State of the Union. One thing it won't do is set a target for when we need to dramatically reduce emissions or come to a net zero emissions. It will not focus on reducing fossil fuels. The party isn't there yet. I want to leave you with a discussion I had with former Congressman Carlos Curbelo, Republican from Florida. He's no longer in Congress, but he was a very outspoken voice for addressing climate change. He was, a proponent, and still is, a proponent for a carbon tax, not a popular idea in either party right now, but especially not the Republican Party. He wants to see aggressive, ambitious climate action, and yet he is, he cautioned me against looking at what Republicans are putting forward in a cynical way. And, his point to me was, if we want to cut emissions, then we need to negotiate with both parties. Nothing big ever got done in Congress with just one party. And maybe people think that these initiatives are not enough or don't go far enough, but you couldn't have a negotiation when one party was saying this is an urgent crisis and the other party was saying this does not exist. Now you have proposals on the table, and that's where negotiation can begin. It remains to be seen how far things get. Obviously, there's nothing that's going to pass in this Congress, maybe not with this president, but a lot of this is laying groundwork for the future. I want to wrap up because we can go from there. Where there's a lot more to talk about if you want to talk about the campaigns in 2020. There's a lot of interesting points of discussion among different candidates and how they're addressing climate change. But I wanted to sort of leave that on that optimistic note because I do see a shift in Congress, a shift in Washington, and I find that, as someone who's covered this for a long time, I find that heartening. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. At this time, I would like to invite Dr. Ryan Fote up to the stage. He's a faculty member and climatologist here at Ohio University. He's going to lead sort of a moderated discussion with Lisa, and then he will open it up to questions from the audience. So that our viewing audience on the live stream can hear those questions, we ask that you please come forward to a microphone. There's one here. They're going to bring this one over to the aisle here when it's time for questions. So please feel free to come up and ask your questions, and they'll answer those after their dialogue here.
Great. Thanks, John. And thank you, Lisa. It's really great to have you here. It's a neat perspective to talk to someone that reports about these issues day in and day out. When we are often combined to our cubicles and in our offices and thinking about them and really concerned about them, but maybe not having the reach or the impact that you may have from a single story. And so I want to ask you first a question. Has there been a story that you've written that was difficult for you? Either you knew it was going to get some pushback, or maybe it started an emotional response to you of hopelessness or concern. And if so, how did you deal with that story?
That's a great question. I mean, there was this story that was kind of critical of Bernie Sanders, and RIP my mentions. But so I think Yes, and it wasn't, before I came to the Times, I spent a lot of time in some of the poorest countries in the world, and I spent a lot of time in Bangladesh in particular. And I think, to see up close the ways that the countries that contributed the least to climate change really are experiencing some of the worst and first impacts of climate change is really very difficult. And at the same time, I think that when you travel, you see how communities also have their own adaptation techniques, and Bangladesh is a great example. I mean, Bangladesh at the time that I was there was putting in, this very poor country, putting in a tremendous amount of money, of its own money, into dealing with a problem that was not of its making. So both sort of difficult to be there and see, people who were rebuilding, homes time and time again, but also to see that the work that was being done in this country on developing new strains of rice to withstand, salination was deeply impressive.
Yeah, and it's really good to think about these places because you don't have to go around and take a poll if they believe climate change is real, right? Because they're seeing the effects of it and they're preparing for them, and they have to adapt to many of these impacts that they're already facing. And I can imagine how difficult that would be to see those sorts of things.
Well, can I add one? Sure. So this isn't a story, but I think about this a lot. So many years ago, I did a story on a study. It was a study that looked at the legal implications of rising sea levels and how they would affect small island nations. And I think the headline of the story was something like, if a country sinks beneath the sea, is it still a country? And I thought that was very clever, right? And this study, talked about, well, would a country still, if it is devastated by sea level rise, would it still have its standing at the UN? Would it lose its fishing rights? And the thing that strikes me about that story was the reaction that it got from leaders of small island nations, which was, there was a gentleman who at the time was a foreign minister of the Marshall Islands. He's since passed away, but he said to me once, I saw that article. And I thought he buttered me up, right? And he said it was, it was very good, and I said thanks. I was pretty proud of it. And he said, I want you to remember when you write about these legal issues, you're writing about my family. You're writing about my children, my grandchildren. This isn't an abstraction for us. This is our country and our culture that is at risk. And so I think that's a conversation I think about a lot when I write these stories.
They're real and they have consequence and they have meaning, right? And they do matter, right?
Yeah.
A related question to that is, so you talked about all these rollbacks that are going on in the current administration, and I imagine when you're writing these, you may feel something, right? And yet, even in your presentation here, you remained really objective. You didn't really say this is bad or good so much. How, as a reporter, do you cover these things that you might have a strong opinion on, but still remain pretty objective when you're writing them?
I think that's just, I don't mean to be flip. It's part of what we do, right? I mean, if we're doing our job right, you don't know how I feel about something. There is a difference between being clear about facts. If somebody says to me something that is factually untrue, I have an obligation to, even if I'm quoting this person in my story, to either not hold the mic for things that are not true, or be sure to say in the story what in the case of science, what the scientific facts are. When it comes to policy, I mean, I think I am able to be objective because I am objective. I think there are there's a lot of debate about what is the best way to address climate change. I'm not an expert. I'm not an energy expert. I'm a reporter. My whole job is to talk to people and find out what they think. And I really value that about my job. I don't think that I would be very good at telling other people what to do. I think my value as a reporter is being able to talk to people from a lot of different avenues, being able to talk to people who work in the oil and gas industry and in the renewable industry, to be able to, some of the people, I talk to climate skeptics all the time on my job, they also are, many of them are also very close to the administration. And so part of my job is knowing where the administration stands and where it's going on issues. And I can't do my job effectively if I don't speak to people that, I might not agree with personally, but who have a point of view that, that I don't want to conflate needing to relay a skeptic point of view, because that is different, but who might have a view of policy that, that I might not personally agree with.
Yeah, that's a really great transition into my next question, because, we might not all be the head climate reporter at the New York Times like you. And,
no, I'm not. I'm a small cog in a big machine. No.
Sure. But to have that position, but we often will have conversations with many people, whether it's family or just other people that we interact with on social media or other places where we're having these challenging conversations around climate change. And so the one thing I took from what you just said now is it's as much as talking as it is listening, and not judging but valuing, recognizing that there might be some value in what they have to bring and say, rather than shutting them down from the get-go. So what kind of advice would you give to a non-reporter, a person like me, or anyone in the audience that wants to talk to someone about climate change when they feel that there might be a different perspective and a difficult conversation to have about it?
I mean, I think it would depend what I have found that it is very difficult to convince people of things that they don't, they just fundamentally don't believe. But I do think there's a deep value in having small conversations about climate change. I'm going to tell you a story, and it's a little circuitous, but there's a point. So a few years ago, I was moderating an event at the French Embassy, and my mother was visiting, and I invited her to come because it was fancy, and and it was about how to communicate climate change. And my mother wanted to ask a question, and because I am a terrible daughter, I pretended I didn't see her, and she was sitting here, and I said, "Oh, I think I see a hand in the back." But afterwards, I learned my mother was sure to tell me what her question was, and it was a great question. What she wanted to talk about was why, in my defense, like there was a 50% chance my mother's question was going to be like, "Lisa, could you have run a brush through your hair before you got on stage?" But my mom wanted to know, why these kinds of discussions on climate change are always in places that are difficult for people to get to. Her point was, like, I can't, it's very nice to have this at the French Embassy or someplace in Washington or even New York, but my mother, who lived in a suburb of New York in Wayne, New Jersey, said, why don't people come to my public library? I can't schlep to New York for something like this, but I'm smart, I've got opinions, I'd like to learn things. And I think about that a lot, and I think, that is where a lot of these conversations are so valuable. It is so valuable to have conversations among policy people and among academics and people and universities. But I think the next step is to take these conversations and have them wherever you are locally, and and as a discussion, not as a forum to tell other people what to think, but, to discuss whether it's the science or the policy.
Yeah, and one of the leaders in climate change communication in the U.S. is Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who has several TED Talks on this topic, and her way of looking at it is we just need to, one of the best things we can do about climate change is just to talk about it more, to have these conversations, but not even so much about the science and what the data show, but why it matters. Why should you care about it? Why does this influence you? Why is this something that you should think about when you're making your decisions in your everyday life? And framing it rather than about the data and the numbers, which you might get in arguments about, or even some of the solutions, which you might get into arguments about, especially in a political realm, but about the values around climate change and why it matters. And a lot of your stories are showing these things. It brings it down to the person level and how this impacts people, or how it impacts water, or how it impacts biodiversity and things that we care about, things that we value. Do you find that is a very effective way to communicate this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the tools we have today are so special. I mean, to be able to, I think, again, I really wish that was our story, but I think about the game, of the Los Angeles Times game, and I just think people are coming up with such inventive, thoughtful ways to make us understand what the implications are for us. To be able to visualize air pollution on your phone, that's amazing. And so I'm really encouraged about all of the new ways we have to be able to tell these stories and help explain to people why it matters to them.
And one last question that's maybe a little selfish here. I have the microphone. So as a natural scientist that studies climate change and talks to the press on occasion, but also communicates the importance of the scientific results, what ways can scientists that are dealing with this, whether it's me as a natural scientist or maybe social scientists that are studying the impacts on people, or economists that are looking at the costs of this, what ways can we better communicate to the media, to people like you, so that the message gets heard more effectively?
I actually think scientists are doing a great job. I think that we talked about this a little over dinner. If you're in the fields, if you're in a scientific field, chances are you are maybe allergic to talking to the media, or scared of talking to the media, or worried that the precision that you work with in your field is not going to translate. And it might not, right? I mean, we do condense things, and it is scary to talk to us. And we won't do things like read back. The number of scientists who ask me if they can see stories before they run is more than the average, and the answer is always no. But a good journalist will come back to you and say, look, I know this is complicated. Am I describing this right? So I think, one of the first steps is really to get out there yourselves and talk with journalists, because we want to know. We want to understand. I spend hours and hours a week talking to scientists, sometimes for stories, sometimes information, the information that isn't for an immediate story, but just to understand recent research or get ideas for future stories. I think if there are journalists you respect, reach out to them and send along your number. We tend to talk to people who, we're not hard to figure out. We talk to people who call us back in a timely manner and are not worried about talking to us. And by that I mean, we don't have to go through a lot of rigmarole of, can we talk off the record, and then I'll maybe talk to you on the record. We need information in a timely manner, and someone who's confident and able to talk to us about their findings and about what are the things that we don't know that we need to know. So I think that we're here waiting for scientists to tell us more.
Awesome. Well, I have plenty more questions, but I will pause and let the audience ask questions. So we do ask that you would step up to a microphone just so that they can be picked up for the live stream, and we will turn them over to Lisa. Here, please. Yes.
95 things that have been rolled back, which are law, which means I can bug my congressman, which are regs, and which are just policy. Of those two things I have less control over.
So the 95 were all regulations, all 95 environmental regulations, and both the blessing and the curse of regulations is that the public has and politicians have less control over it, right? I mean, on the one hand, if Congress had passed climate legislation, that might have taken care of a lot of the things that President Obama had to enact or felt he had to enact through regulation that are now being rolled back. But as it is, all of those 95 are regulations. They're in various stages of proposed and final, and all of them have comment periods. But those that have been finalized, once it's been finalized, it's a court battle, and environmental groups generally are taking the administration, and blue states are taking the administration to court to stop a lot of these rollbacks.
On that point, I understand there are hundreds of cases against President Trump, and he will not have to respond until he is out of office. But the way the Republicans have been taking over the judiciary, do you have any faith that the legal system can put a brake on Trump's destruction?
Yeah, I mean, the turnover of the court, the restructuring of the courts is going to have an impact on the outcome of a lot of these lawsuits. Just to step back for a second, what we saw in the beginning of the administration was that, particularly when it came to environmental regulations, there was a lot of sloppiness. Scott Pruitt, who was the first head of the EPA, and this is we've written about this, loved to have press conferences declaring that he was rolling something back or stopping something that was in place while the administration reviewed it and considered rolling it back. It turns out, though, that you have to put almost as much work into undoing a regulation as you do into making a regulation. And the administration found that out the hard way. And so a lot of its early efforts to suspend regulations while they worked on the official repeal were stymied by the courts. We're in a different world now where, the new administrator, there's a lot less drama than there was in the Pruitt administration, but he's also much more effective and much more thorough in making these regulations, these regulatory rollbacks airtight. So, a lot of them, like you said, are being challenged by the courts. I think that there is a lot of hope among conservatives that the remaking of the courts will help keep some of the deregulation in place. But it's, right now it's just way too early. It's way too early to tell.
Sorry, I'm short. Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm a junior at Athens High School, and I'm interested in journalism and environmentalism, and I wanted to ask you if you had any advice for people who are interested in journalism, or more specifically, environmental journalism.
Get a job at a newspaper. But also have an exit strategy, because it's so hard to work. So look, I really believe, like I said earlier, I came in a very circuitous route to climate coverage. And there's no right way. I think it's amazing and unique, to have a body of knowledge on the environment and bring that to news coverage. I also think it's really valuable to come at something cold and be able to go to scientists, for example, and say, treat me like a really smart 7th grader. Explain this to me from the beginning because I do not understand the greenhouse effect. And you know, you bring different things to it that way. Truly, I think that newspapers are still the best jobs out there. You know, I worked at local papers for years, and I learned so much. You know, there's really there's so few other jobs where you could be, you know, 24 years old and the mayor has to answer your questions, right? And then also you're learning how to read a budget, and then you walk down the street and then there's a house with a bunch of cast iron sculptures, and you're like, hey, what's that about? And you go and knock on someone's door and you interview them, and they're interesting, and then you write a story about it, and then someone pays you. It's a great job. I love newspapers. So I really think that even if your passion is environmental journalism, I think newspapers and general reporting is a great grounding, and that's something that I would recommend to any journalist.
Thank you so much.
Hi there. Thanks for being here, first of all. So my question is on a bit of a different tone, so I just want to state that from the start. So I've heard our historical moment described as a predicament, and you can correct me on the climate science here, but to stay within 1.5 degrees warming, we would have to go net zero by 2025, which there's no talk of at the moment. And to stay below 2 degrees warming above pre-industrial averages, we would have to halve our carbon emissions by 2030 in 10 years. And the talk is of 2050. So my question is that it seems like change is inevitable, whether it is using clean energy to conduct society differently, probably on a more relocalized scale, or change in the form of suffering because we didn't do anything about this. And so I've been looking into this, or I've been trying to engage this sort of predicament, but not in the form that falls into nihilism and doom, because I don't think that's productive either. And I've been learning about the deep adaptation movement, or group, I guess, written by a professor of sustainability in the UK. His name is Jem Bendell. The paper is available online. It's Deep Adaptation. Not a plug for him. But I'm wondering if I don't know if this is beyond the scope of your reporting, but if you could speak to the changes and how we might expect our lives to unfold, or more so maybe just, it seems like climate science focuses on a certain date to save things by, and it doesn't have as much room for conversations about dealing with the damage already done.
Sure. Well, there's a lot there. I'm not sure where to start, but let me start with. I'm gonna give you all the science questions, but I do think it's important to kind of recognize that while yes, to avoid the worst impacts, we need to get to net zero emissions well before 2050. It is not a case where we fall off a cliff in 12 years. It gets harder and more expensive to reduce emissions the longer we wait. And the impacts to our biodiversity, to our ecology, to our homes and communities gets harder to adapt to, and it gets more expensive. Do you feel like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, yeah, and these projections are like the 2030 or the 2050 data are best estimates based on model projections of future change, both in greenhouse gases and the response of the atmosphere to those, and the ocean and the ice. that there's wiggle room around that depending on feedbacks and other processes, and so it's not necessarily that's the exact date, but it's our best estimate of that date, and it's for planning purposes to know the urgency of these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just say, one of the things that, we have an obligation as reporters to both communicate the urgency of dealing with climate change and not, and not create a false sense of doom. And so one of the stories that I didn't put up there, but I wish I had, was, we did a piece looking at the difference between keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees rise over pre-industrial levels and 2 degrees, to coral reefs, to food security, to desertification. It's stark, it's big, but it also shows you that, we have to make good use of the time we have, not that we are doomed in 12 years.
Yeah, and I'll follow on with that, that you have an opportunity to continue to work for the future that you want to have, right? Whether that's continue to voice your concern and vote that way, make choices each and every day of your life, and encourage others to do that and policymakers to do that, so that you can continue to help shape that future. You're not powerless in this, that there is still time. Yes, it is getting quicker and quicker, but doing nothing is absolutely the wrong choice. And doing something and continuing to inspire others to do things is a way forward in this time of uncertainty.
I also want to thank you for coming tonight. It's been a
for
very
having
interesting
me.
talk. And I appreciate all that you do. This is most important things that people could report on in this point in human history. So I want to ask about journalistic issues rather than scientific issues. Okay, so journalists for quite a long time, following the norms of journalistic balance, acted like there was anything like balance in the evidence about climate. A great deal of time was squandered in that period. And now, from what you've said tonight, it looks like Republicans are starting to accept the truth of anthropogenic warming and are coming up with their own proposals. And I can already see that's going to be the story that's queuing up in the journalistic practice of quote unquote balance. What concerns me is that that's a way to frame things, but it's the same way of framing things that kind of got us here to midway through decade zero, halfway through decade zero. Another way to frame the story would be to ask Republicans, who now are apparently starting to admit that the climate is changing in dire ways, why did it take them so long to get here? What were the sources of information that they were relying on that kept them in the dark for so long? And given that they've squandered so much time, why would we want to give more attention to folks that are not paying attention to crediting the best of scientific evidence? Why aren't journalists explaining the way, for instance, the IPCC does its work, that 195 countries participate in the IPCC, that thousands of scientists participate, that every 5 years or 7 years, every single peer-reviewed science piece in every conceivable field that's related, bugs and fish and ice and air and water temperature and every conceivable, they're studying all of that, they're reviewing all of that. Why is that not discussed and juxtaposed to whatever it is, whoever it is, whatever think tank or other industrial spokespersons, the denial, the folks that are finally now apparently not denying? Why is that not the story? How did it take you so long? And why should we pay attention to what you're saying? And who are your sources now compared to who the scientists, who the folks that are concerned about being midway through decade zero?
I think you're right. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think you hit on something that we struggle with all the time. I think that, and you hit on also on an issue that I think Washington struggles with, right? When I talk to, I moderated a panel recently with a Republican and a Democrat who both want to address climate change, and some others on the panel, including some folks from a woman from New Consensus, which is one of the groups that had helped write policy for the Green New Deal. And in the discussion of, okay, what is the thing that can be done now in a bipartisan fashion, now that we have some buy-in from Republicans, the response from the woman from New Consensus was, why are we talking about this small stuff? We are in a moment of urgency, and it's great that they've come to the table, but we are like, we need to leave the restaurant now. This is so far beyond the sort of small bore solutions that are being offered up by one side. That is one way of looking at it. On the other hand, do you need to shame a party and call them to account for years of climate denial before you move forward, or can you just move forward? I think that's the other conversation that's happening in Washington. Okay, let's not belabor the past. If we are at a moment where there can be some common ground, let's seize it and use it. I'm not the person to answer that. I think from a journalistic perspective, what I would go back to is, the good news is what I mentioned at the top of my talk, which is that I really do think this is an unusual age of a plethora of climate journalism. Not only do you have folks like institutions like the Times and now the Washington Post pouring resources into climate coverage, you also have publications like Inside Climate News that come at this from a much clearer activist perspective, and I mean that in the best way. I mean they are want to see climate action, and their journalism reflects that. The Guardian, which is very clearly saying we are calling this a climate crisis, and we are no longer accepting fossil fuel ads from fossil fuel companies. There's a lot of choices now for where you get your news, and there's a lot of reporters from a lot of different areas that are converging on this topic.
Sweet. First of all, thank you so much, both of you, for being here. You've mentioned this sort of throughout your talk, but you talk about not coming from an environmental science background and getting into journalism. I was curious, sort of a similar topic to the last question, but about the nature of journalism in general and how it's changed. I was wondering, coming at such a complex issue like climate change and trying to report on that, it's, as you mentioned, very, very exciting to be able to talk about so many different issues and learn about so many different issues. But how do you find that sort of the high pressure and fast-paced nature of sort of the journalism world interacting with you being able to produce quality content as a journalist? And maybe there are some stories specifically of certain ethical dilemmas you've had to face.
Let's see, I can't think of one of an ethical dilemma, but certainly the pressure. I finished a story about an hour before I spoke. So I came out for dinner tonight. I've written stories in a Valero gas station parking lot. It's at the same time, at a place like the Times, we are really lucky. I mean, I'm on deadline all the time. I'm running from story to story, but for stories that really matter, I'm also in a unique position where they give us the time to dig into stories, and that is still a really rare thing in journalism that I just cherish. I'm going to think more on the ethical quandary question because I don't have an example off the top of my head.
I also want to thank you for being here. I think climate change is a really interesting topic. I actually was part of the negotiations team of Ecuador in a couple of the negotiations meetings. And although I think we are all part of climate change and that we all have to do something, I think governments have major tools to change things faster. And my question here is, I always saw how there was kind of this fight between the United States and China in the negotiations. And before the Paris Agreement was signed, the United States always pushed for a new convention, not just for a new agreement. And they wanted to change kind of everything because China is not really responsible for doing anything with the convention we have now. So my question is, do you think if it at some point all countries agree that the convention has to be changed because things have changed over years, that maybe the United States and other countries that are not engaging might engage more and better?
That's such a great question. I'm gonna take a step back and just explain for people who might not be as familiar with the international negotiations. The Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement really changed the structure of how countries deal with climate change. And by that I mean since the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol said, wealthy industrialized countries are obligated to cut emissions. Everyone else can, if they want to, do it voluntarily, and they should get funding in order to do that. What happened, over the next 20 years, you had basically the U.S. and China saying, you go first, no, you go first, no, you go first, no, you go first. George Bush pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol, or pulled out is the right word, but pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol. And when the Obama administration came into office, one of their top priorities was really fundamentally changing the structure so that all countries participate. Maybe countries of different levels of wealth or past responsibility for climate change might do different things, might cut emissions at different levels, but they wanted all countries to be held to the same legal standards, to the same legal obligations. And that happened. That is what the Paris Agreement did that is so different and so unique. And that began with the United States and China jointly emerging with plans to cut emissions. In the case of the United States, to cut emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. In the case of China, to promise to peak by, I want to say 2030. And so, you have the criticism of China's plan is, well, China can, just do it at once and emit willy-nilly for the next 16 years, 16 dating back from 2015. But you also can't just turn off the spigot, right? So China is reducing its coal. It's going to peak by 2030. And that joint announcement was huge. I mean, to have the US and China come out together and say, we're both going to act, was a massive change, because under the way the United Nations architecture is written, China is considered a developing country, and it doesn't have to do anything. So now we're in a new world where the US has announced it's going to withdraw. It cannot actually withdraw until the day after Election Day. Not a coincidence. That is how they wrote it. And I think the answer to your question is actually very hard, because I'm not sure I really see clearly what the future of the Paris Agreement is, or the international negotiations, even if a Democrat were to win. If a Democrat wins, all the Democratic candidates have said, day one, we're going to get back into the Paris Agreement. And they may do that. But the world has now seen this movie twice, right? Where the United States joins an international agreement, and then under a Democrat, and then a Republican takes office and we pull out. And I think there's a lot of broken trust. And I think other countries are going to demand a lot of proof that the United States is really engaged in climate change if the White House moves into Democratic hands. And I think there's just not a lot of trust that the United States is a real partner anymore.
Okay. Yeah, one more.
That was so long. I'm so sorry. I spent like 10 years covering these negotiations, and you got me in a roll.
Hey there. So bringing this more back to like a local perspective, my name is Jacob, and I serve in AmeriCorps in Athens City Schools, and I work more within the county doing things with rural people. So what is a way to have this conversation with rural people in mind? Because a lot of times they're forgotten in this conversation, and a lot of times when I work with people who don't have a lot of resources, it's hard for them to think about something like climate change when that's not really the first thing that's on their mind. So how can you bring this conversation to relate more so to the people of Athens County and Appalachia in general, if you've interviewed people like that before?
So we were actually just having this conversation at dinner in a different context, but several years ago I went to the Himalayas to follow a group of scientists who were working on glacier melt. And what I found was that people in the Khumbu Range were a little sick of people coming to talk to them about climate change, and they really wanted to talk about sanitation and clean water. And so I think that, I think the key is not necessarily talking to communities, but listening to communities about what their needs and concerns are. And, you or your colleagues are the experts also, and you can bring an understanding of climate change and how climate change weaves into whatever the local issues are, because climate change does touch all these other local issues. But I would say that it starts with listening to communities instead of necessarily talking to them.
Again, thank you very much for coming here and being part of this conversation. I think it might have been the Times that ran a story a while back about climate despair and amongst people, scientists, as well as activists, and probably many of us in this audience. Can you talk a little bit about hope and is there such a thing in your world, knowing what you know, looking at politics and policy, and maybe touch on whether or not Citizen United is the thing we should focus on versus specific environmental policies?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to, because I see hope everywhere. My colleague Brad, his Twitter handle is that he covers the apocalypse beat, and I don't know why I mentioned that, except that it's very, I think it's funny and and sad and true, but also we talk about how there is so much happening in the world of renewable energy on local levels, on personal levels. I am one who is a firm believer that while it is very important to change personal behavior, what we really need is systemic change. So I get a little annoyed when I see presidential candidates being asked whether they use straws or not, because what we really need to think about are political changes and systemic changes. That said, it does start personally and locally. We do a newsletter every week, Climate Forward, and it always includes a one thing you can do. When I go around the country and talk to local leaders, I am amazed at the speed with which cities that you wouldn't think would embrace 100% renewable energy goals are doing so. You've got a Republican mayor in Indiana who's working towards this, the mayor of Salt Lake City, Pittsburgh. The president made a point of saying in his speech when he withdrew from the Paris Agreement that he represents Pittsburgh, not Paris, but the people of Pittsburgh are embracing a clean energy future, and I find all of that incredibly hopeful. I think the market is changing faster than the politics, and maybe that's just the way, of the world. But I think that is one of many things that is going to spur political change.
"2050, it's not that far away. And when I think about society, I don't think that we have a tendency to react and to mobilize pretty quickly. I mean, in my lifetime, maybe the race to the moon is about the only thing that I really can think of where we mobilize quickly. So as a communicator, having spoken to people in the US and throughout, what do you think the chances are that we as people can come together behind a single idea and actually to mobilize? I'm not saying that we shouldn't try. I'm just saying, in your experiences, do you think it's doable?
I'm resisting
I'll let you think about it for a second, but I will say that in terms of environmental policy, the ozone hole was discovered in the mid-1980s, and in the 1990s, the Montreal Protocol came about. And that was one of the most effective pieces of environmental policy because now we're seeing signs of the ozone hole recovering. And so, it was a worldwide effort led by US in many ways, but, to ban certain substances that were depleting the ozone layer. And so that happened fairly quickly and had a global impact, and it's still having this lasting impact now. Now, granted, the solutions to climate change are a little bit more challenging, and there's not as many. Part of the reason why that was so successful was there's this economic alternative that worked really well at the time, and so it is not too costly, and there's some benefits of moving away from CFCs and other things. But that was one case where we mobilized quickly in an environmental way and had a very lasting and positive impact. So there is hope in the history of environmental policy.
I'm going to leave it there.
Oh, no. Last word.
I don't. This would be a very depressing business to be in if there was. I think that this dovetails with your question, right? I mean, if all I was writing about was what's not getting done, I don't know how much longer I could stay on a beat like this. I think part of what makes this beat really one that I cherish is that in addition to having to tell and being responsible for telling explaining the impacts of climate change and what the government at this moment in time is not doing, I'm also out there seeing and talking to people about what is being done. I don't, can we meet a goal of net zero by 2050? I don't know. I don't know where to begin with an answer for that. I would have a whole different job, I think, if I can answer that. But I will, but I do want to leave this on a note that, both politically and practically, I think we're seeing so much more interest in climate change, acceptance slow from some corners, maybe slower than we'd like, but happening, coupled with, real passion from young people in particular, an impatience that is necessary, that's pushing the other side of this. And I really think that the combination of that is what's going to move us forward. I'm gonna go with hopeful.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Dr. Fote and Lisa Friedman. Let's give them a round of applause.